500 years ago, Luca Pacioli wrote a book on double entry. He laid down all the rules, used the words debit and credit, and we've been following them for 500 years. And there are lots of videos that'll tell you how they work, but they don't tell you how they were developed and why they work. This one will be different. By going back to Pacioli's book, I can tell you the derivation of these things, why they work, not just how. I've been teaching it that way at the London Business School for 25 years. And now it's time for Pacioli and me to share our knowledge with you. Let me tell you a little bit about Pacioli. He grew up in a little village not far away from Venice. Venice in those days was a live, bustling, thriving place like London or New York are today. He went to Venice when he was 19. He was employed by a merchant to teach his sons accounting. But the merchant found that Pacioli didn't know any accounting. So he decided to put him into his own office with his other clerks to learn it. And I can imagine Pacioli being told by these clerks, "Learn the rules. Do it this way. Don't ask questions." Well, that's what happened to me anyway.
But Pacioli progressed. He became a teacher, then a professor of maths, and later on a monk. He met all sorts of interesting people, including the Pope, and he spent many months with Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo illustrated some of Pacioli's books, and Pacioli taught Leonardo perspective. But Pacioli thought back to when he'd been a clerk and seen merchants succeed, like this fellow with the ruff. He's obviously doing very well. But he'd also seen them fail, and he was sure they'd failed because they didn't keep their books properly. So he decided to write a book telling them how to do that. And a very good book it is. We've been using it for 500 years. In all countries and all companies in the world. But he didn't explain where he got the rules from. And that's where I come in. And I'm going to tell you why double entry is used and why the words debit and credit are used. Let me tell you a bit about the journey that we are going on, starting with Pacioli's crucial points. The first one of which was, you must regard a business as having a separate identity. The second one concerned the mathematical knowledge in the 15th century. Professors, particularly of mathematics, understood subtraction, but the man in the street, the merchant, the clerk, did not. Today, if we wanted to know the difference between 10 and 7, we would say, take 10, subtract 7, answer 3. But in the 15th century, they would have said, take 7, what do we have to add to it to get to 10? Answer 3. No subtraction. No minus signs. They couldn't deal with minus signs. Might be hard to believe, but it's true. Negative things were a no-no in the 15th century. And this made a big difference as to how the whole system developed. Then we're going to consider the worksheet heart, which was at the back of Pacioli's mind as he examined the system used in Venice at that time. It is equation-based. Assets equals liabilities, which later Pacioli turned into assets minus liabilities equals 0. We are going to use it to build up a small business, after which you will understand how double entry works, why it works that way, why the terms debit and credit had to be used, and even more, you'll understand how the whole accounting system works. My book Understand Accounting comes next. It's a chatty book. And I'll also tell you about the videos that we're going to produce, the first of which will be based on The Merchant of Venice by Shakespeare. This is Pacioli's most important and central point, that you must regard a business as being separate from yourself. That means that from the business's point of view, you are a liability. Yes, it owes you money, just like later on it will owe a supplier money. Here we have a business, ROBBY. Standing next to it is its owner. She is identifying with it, as all owners do. But she shouldn't. She should be separate. So let's separate them. There. Now, if Robbie is going to trade, it needs something to trade with. So the owner puts cash into Robbie. It is not Robbie's cash. He owes it back to her. It's her capital. So Robbie now has an asset, cash, and a liability, capital. A little equation, assets equals liabilities, or in our case, cash equals capital. I expect you've been used to using ledgers. Well, I want you to tear out the pages from those ledgers. And here you can see a table. And on that table, I want you to arrange the asset and expense accounts on the left-hand side. Write an equals on a bit of paper, stick it down in the middle, and then put the capital and any other liabilities and revenue and profit on the right-hand side. So now we've got assets equals liabilities. Let's look at that now as a worksheet. Here you are, look. We've got cash equals capital. Let's say the owner puts 1,000 cash into Robbie. So we'll put 1,000 in the cash column. And this is an equation. It is equal to 1,000 in the capital column. Now cash, of course, is a very sterile asset. Put it under the mattress, it won't grow, will it? So the owner says to Robbie, go and buy some inventory. Spend 400 on it. So we take 400 out of cash. But it doesn't balance. Where else are we going to put it? Well, in accounting, you never get stuck. If you can't see where to put it, just open another column. There it is, inventory. And we can put the 400 into inventory. Now Robbie is ready to start selling. Robbie makes his first sale. He sells 15 items at 15 each, a revenue of 225, and the buyer pays cash. So we put 225 in the cash column. Now we want to record the revenue, but we haven't got a revenue column. Oh, remember what I said? Let's open one. There it is. And we put the 225 in it. But that's not the end of the story. The inventory column shows that he still has 400. But he doesn't have 400. He sold 15 of them. Let's say they cost 10 each. So he has to record the cost of the goods sold. 150. He takes the 150 out of inventory and puts it, we need a new column, expenses, there it is. Now what has he done? He's converted an asset into an expense. That's very important. All assets become expenses as they get used up. But what if Robbie did not sell for cash? He sold on what is called credit. He gave his customer time to pay. And maybe, of course, he would not buy for cash. He would buy on credit. And his supplier would give him time to pay. So we need more columns. We need one for accounts payable to show that he has not yet paid the 400 that he owes. We need one for accounts receivable to show that he has not yet received the 225. Instead of records in cash, we now have records in accounts receivable and accounts payable. Now the buyer pays us 100 and we pay our supplier 200. But did he make a profit? Well, to find that out, we need a profit column. And there you see one, on the right. Most of the figures you see are the same, but I've also included a payment of wages. So, cash minus 50, expenses 50. And we can transfer the two temporary columns, revenues and expenses, into the profit column to see if we've made a profit. Let's transfer the revenues first. Minus 225 in revenue, plus 225 in profit. Now the expenses. Minus 200 and minus 200. Now we add them up. And yes, we have made a profit. But of course Pacioli couldn't say to the merchants of Venice, here's the worksheet, stick it on the wall, put an equal sign where the window is. No, of course he couldn't. You can't have an equal sign in the accounting system. Got to get rid of it. Now, how is Pacioli going to do that? I'll use a simple equation to explain it. Here we are, 5 plus 2 equals 7. And we want to get rid of the 7 on the right-hand side. You remember the rule at school, of course. Take it to the other side and change the sign. I don't like that rule. It's not what's happening anyway. What you're really doing is subtracting 7 from both sides. So let's do that. 5 plus 2 minus 7 equals 7 minus 7. And of course the 2 on the right-hand side will disappear. And we're left with 5 plus 2 minus 7, which is self-balancing. So let's apply that idea to a simplified worksheet first and then to the bigger one later. Here we have our simplified worksheet, just the cash and capital bits. And we want to convert it. We do that by subtracting the capital 1000 from both sides of the equation. There you see it in red. The 2 on the right, of course, as before, will disappear. And this is what we've got instead. Converted. Yes, the equation has gone. Now we have a plus number balanced by a minus number, so each row will equal 0. Let's just look at the sales one, for example. We have 225 in accounts receivable, and we have minus 225 in revenue. Every row balances to 0. And that is true when we make the transfers to see if we've made a profit. We transfer the revenues figure. It has a minus in it, so we put a plus and a minus to balance it in profit. We transfer the expenses figure, we put a minus in it, and then a plus in profit. We add them up, and we find that we have indeed made a profit. All that the minus sign indicates is that Robbie owes this profit to the owners. It's not his profit. He made it, but he owes it to the owners. All the minus signs you will see indicate something that Robbie owes to somebody, owners or suppliers, as the case may be. But Pacioli was still worried about one particular thing, and that is when you look at the cash column, you'll see you have plus and minus numbers mixed up in it. Is that important? Well, yes, it is. If a merchant can't keep control of his cash, he'll lose it, and he'll lose his business too. He wants to know how much cash came in a period and how much cash went out. Same with inventory. He needs to know how much came in, how much went out, how much have I got left. But Pacioli didn't have to worry for long. He looked at the system that was being used in Venice at that time, and he saw that it didn't just have one column under each heading, it had 2. One for the pluses and one for the minuses. I see. I'll do that. The answer was to have 2 columns under each heading, a column for the plus entries and a column for the minus entries. It works for the cash. It works for all of the columns. And there you see them, plus, minus. Now, the numbers don't have any signs on them. They take their signs from the columns that they're in. So when we look at invest, we see 1,000 and 1,000 with no signs on them, but one is in the plus column, one is in the minus column, and they still add up to 0. Well, it's true for all of the rows. And we add them up, and what do you find? We've lost the balances. How are we going to get those back? So let's see how they did it. Remember, the clerks are not able to do subtraction. They don't understand subtraction. Negativity really was a no-no in the 15th century. So how do you find the difference between 2 numbers? Well, I mentioned that earlier. You take the smaller one and add an amount until you get to the bigger one. So let's apply that to the inventory column. We've got 400 in the plus column, the buy. We've got 150 in the minus column, the cost of goods sold. Adding them up, but of course there's only 2 numbers, so we can see that the biggest is the 400. And Pacioli said, put the 400 as the total of both columns. Well, obviously 150 doesn't add up to 400. What do we need? 250. So put it in. There it is. Now we've put it into a minus column, and the system will not work unless we put it into a plus column as well. Well, we have. We've put it in the plus column below the totals. There's no reason why we shouldn't use the same inventory account to do that. There we are. We've brought it down. That's the inventory that's left, and no minus signs in sight. Now let's apply that to the big worksheet. The balances are back. At the bottom of each heading now you can see how the balance has been carried down. The arrows indicate it. We don't need to go through all the rows, of course, you know those numbers by now. But I should mention the journal. It's not part of the accounting double entry system, it's an instruction book. It tells you where to put the numbers. We've just been happily putting these numbers into the columns willy-nilly. Well, not quite. And the book would say, put this in the plus column, put this in the minus column. Or as we'll find out later, it'll say, put this in a debit column, put this in a credit column. I'm coming to that problem now. Pacioli would have looked at the top of these columns and seen the pluses and the minuses. Oh dear. But he need not have worried. When he looked again at the system being used in Venice at that time, he saw that the pluses and minuses had been replaced. Ah, he thought, I think I know why they did that. Let me explain it. I think Pacioli's religious training helped him here. He thought to himself, everything that Robbie holds, it owes to the owner or to the people who supplied it. And the verb for to owe is debere. So that's where the system got this idea of calling the plus items debits. DR for short. They've called the plus columns debit columns, the left-hand side ones. They've also used the word as a verb, telling the clerks to debit, which means enter something in the left-hand column, any left-hand column. Then he thought about the right-hand column, the minus column, and thought Robbie owes everything that it has either to the owner or to suppliers who are trusting the company to pay them one day. And the verb for to trust is credere. We shortened that to credit. So they've replaced the minus sign with the word credit. The name of the minus column is credit column. And they've also used it as a verb. To credit means to make an entry in the right-hand column, in any account. That's what it means. So, debits and credits replace pluses and minuses. And if only the clerks had understood subtraction, they would have used pluses and minuses and not debits and credits. We would never have had debits and credits. But we've got them. And since we've got them, there is one more problem we must look at. Look at this lady. She's blowing on her food. It's too hot, and she's cooling it down. Now look at this chap. He's out in the snow. His hands are freezing cold, so he's blowing on them to warm them up. My goodness, anybody that can blow hot and cold air out of the same mouth must be very dangerous. If I was an alien, I'd run away. But that's what we have been doing in accounting all these years. A debit will seem to increase an account, and then a debit will go and decrease an account. It's doing two things, just like the hot and cold air. But it's not the fault of the debit or the credit, it's the fault of the account that they're going into. Asset and expense accounts have their balances on the left. So if you put a debit entry, a left-hand entry, into them, you increase the account. But if you put a debit into a liability or revenue account, which have their balances on the right, you will decrease them. It's not the fault of the debit, it's the fault of the account it's going into. And the same with the credits. If you put a credit into an asset or expense account, you will decrease it because it has its balance on the left. If you put a credit into a revenue or capital account, you will increase it because they have the balances on the right. Let's take another look at the worksheet. First of all, I think we ought to replace those pluses and minuses with debits and credits, don't you? Here they come. This is the complete accounting system in a nutshell. So it does contain the balance sheet, the profit and loss account, and the cash flow statement that you will see in published accounts. I've coloured them. The profit and loss in blue, the cash flow slightly green, and a brownie colour for the balance sheet. Let's look at the profit and loss account first. It's a storybook. It tells you what's been happening during the year. The sales, the cost of goods sold, the gross profit, the wages, and how much profit they had left. Mind you, the sales figures and the cost of goods sold figures record the items that they sold. They do not give you any indication as to whether they were paid for in cash. So we need another storybook, a cash flow storybook. Here we see the capital paid in, but when we come to the operating, we paid out more than we got in. Customers gave us 100, we paid suppliers 200 and paid wages of 50. So our cash has gone down to 850. Why? Because all the sales and the cost of goods sold were not paid for yet. That's important. A company can still appear profitable, but still fail because it didn't get the cash in. Now let's look at the balance sheet. You can think of this as being a photograph of the business at a moment in time. It doesn't have any fixed assets, buildings, machinery or cars, but it does have current assets, things that turn over during the year, inventory, accounts receivable and cash. It finances some of those by not paying its suppliers, so we have an accounts payable. And we have net assets of 1025. All of this is due to the owner, her capital that she put in of 1,000 and the profit that Robbie has earned for her of 25. So there you see, we have the financial statements out of the worksheet. The worksheet has been very useful for explaining how everything works. But you'll never see one. Now we go back to what you started with, the ledgers. All a ledger is a collection of these headings that have been cut up from the worksheet. Get the scissors out, cut. Put the headings into different ledgers. General ledger, cash book, sales ledger, accounts receivable ledger, accounts payable ledger, you name it, any ledger you want. I've not even mentioned the private ledger. That's the one that the directors keep private for themselves. They don't want everybody seeing what goes in the private ledger, do they? As I said before, this is the accounting system in a nutshell. Now you understand it. Now you know why debits and credits are used. You now know why we have two columns with plus and minuses equaling 0. But I find that this worksheet is also very useful as a planning document. Let's have a look at that. I don't put numbers into the boxes. I put references. References to where I've put the numbers outside of the worksheet. Then I can change those numbers. As I change them, the worksheet recalculates the profit and loss account, the cash flow, and the closing balance sheet. I can link these worksheets together through the closing balance sheet figures. They become the opening balance sheet of the next period. I often think in terms of 5 years. So I actually can produce 5 years worth of profit and loss accounts, balance sheets, cash flows, and change them and flex them and see what difference it will make. I can extract them, I can do ratio analysis on them, and I can see whether my plans are good or bad. Now let me tell you about my book. Understand Accounting is written like a novel. Its main character is Andrew. He's been made redundant and he's going to set up a new business. He meets with me in the pub and sometimes in my office, and I help him develop 5-year plans so that he can go to the bank and borrow some money. And he learns accounting without even knowing he's doing so. It's available on Amazon. You can get it as an e-book, but I don't recommend it. It's much easier to read the worksheets if you get the hard copy. Remember, you can pause the video to read these reviews. We've reached the end of our journey, so let me summarize what we've covered in this video. We started with Pacioli, went back to his equation assets equals liabilities. Saw how he wanted to separate out the business from the owner and keep the records from the business's point of view. Saw how we could use a worksheet to record all the transactions and eventually to work out whether he made a profit or not. We saw how the worksheet could be expanded to cover assets, expenses, liabilities, revenues, accounts receivable, accounts payable, and we saw how we could get the profit and loss balance sheet and cash flow out of it. The accounting system in a nutshell. The next big step was when they moved from double entry using single columns to double entry using double columns. And the reason for this was that they really wanted to make sure that a merchant could control his cash. Therefore, he needed to group the increases together and the decreases separately so that he could see how much came in and how much went out. No cash control, no business. And they applied it to all the other accounts too. But as a result, they lost the balances when they totaled the two columns. How to get them back? Well, you do it by addition, not subtraction, because as you know, they cannot cope with subtraction. And then Pacioli realized why they'd introduced the terms debit and credit. It was again because they couldn't cope with subtraction. The idea of negativity and minus signs was foreign to them. So they had to disguise the plus and the plus with the word debit or DR, and the minus with the word credit or CR. Finally, he had to get rid of the equal sign because you can't have one in a double entry system. How did he do it? He subtracted the right-hand sides from both sides. That meant that the double entry approach was to put something in the plus column and the same thing in a minus column, or, to use up-to-date terminology, debit something and credit something. Now there were no minus signs, there were no equal signs. We'd got up to the modern double entry system we use today. Introducing the debit and credit led to another problem, illustrated by the two pictures. Blowing on food to cool it down, blowing on hands to warm them up. Yes, debits and credits have given this problem. Debits increase and debits decrease. Credits increase, credits decrease. It's confused everybody. And it wasn't the fault of the debits and the credits, it's the fault of the account they go in. Asset and expense accounts have their balances on the left. So a debit increases them and a credit decreases them. Whereas liability and revenue accounts have their balances on the right. So a debit, a left-hand entry, will decrease them, and a credit, a right-hand entry, will increase them. You just have to know which sort of account you're putting the left-hand or right-hand entry into. The worksheet has been very useful, but you'll never see one. We're back to ledgers again. Produce the scissors. Cut, cut, cut. Put the pages in ledgers. All sorts of ledgers. As long as you obey the rule, put the same entry into a left-hand and a right-hand column, or, in modern terminology, debit and credit the same amount. It can be in the same account, can be in different accounts, can be in different ledgers. Doesn't matter. As long as you stick to the system, it'll work. We saw the ledger was supported by the journal, which tells you where to put the items. You debit this account and you credit that account, with a little explanation. It is not part of the double entry system, it's an instruction. And we talked about my book, and the videos to follow, including the Merchant of Venice one, which I'm looking forward to doing. My website, understandaccounting.com, contains several case studies with answers based upon the worksheet approach that we've been using. There's a lot on Pacioli, telling you all about him. There's quite a bit on me. There's a copy of my paper, recently published by De Computis, called Pacioli, Algebra and Double Entry. There are excerpts from my book, Understand Accounting, so you can have a look and see if you want to buy it. And if you do buy it, please get the hard copy, because you'll find the worksheets much easier to read. On a mobile or iPad, they'd be really small, I'm afraid. I'm also writing another book, Understand Mathematics, For those of you who missed out on it at school, felt you didn't really understand it, and of course for teenagers who are learning it at school now. Again, it's not ready yet, but if you visit my website you'll find out when it will be. Shakespeare and Pacioli. Well, they both liked Venice. Pacioli went there to work. He became a professor there, as you know, and wrote a book that we've been talking about. Shakespeare, on the other hand, I don't think he went there, but he did write about it, didn't he? He wrote a play called The Merchant of Venice. And surprisingly, in that play there is a business, Antonio, who buys ships, sends them off to trade. And I've put numbers to this business, and I thought it'd be fun to use Pacioli's methods to analyse it. And that's what I've done. It reinforces the learning of this video too, so I hope you'll go to it and like it.
Remember, treat your business as being separate from yourself. Keep the records from its point of view, and from its point of view, you, the owner, are a liability. The whole system is equation-based. If you alter one thing in an equation, you have to alter another, otherwise it won't balance. We use assets minus liabilities equaling 0, i.e. self-balancing. You don't need an equals sign. You have two columns so that you can separate out the increases and the decreases. Very important to know how much came in, how much went out, and the balance. Plus and minus makes life easy. But the clerks back then couldn't understand negativity and minus signs. So the idea of to owe and to trust was brought in. To owe being debere, to trust being credere, and we got debits and credits, and they replaced the plus and the minus. But then they were used as instructions too, to debit and to credit. To debit means put it in the left-hand column. To credit means to put in the right-hand column. That's all. But they have different effects upon accounts depending whether the account has its balance on the left, like asset and expense accounts, or on the right, like liability and revenue accounts. It's not that debits increase and decrease things, it's that they go into different accounts and have a different effect. If the account has its balance on the left, a debit increases it. If an account has its balance on the right, a debit decreases it, and the opposite for credits. I think that's enough reminders. If I don't stop, I'll be doing it all over again. So I hope to see you again at the Merchant of Venice. Bye!